On the 4th of July 1946, 200,000 people in Gdansk witnessed the executions of some of the most evil concentration camp guards of the Second World War. A number of huge gallows had been created to execute the men and women in front of the large crowd, and these guards had worked at Stutthof Concentration Camp. Stutthof was a site which was known for its brutality and horror, and it's estimated that 65,000 of the 110,000 people who were held there were killed. The guards of Stutthof were incredibly cruel, and they carried out executions and slaughter on a daily basis, and violent beatings would often result in further death. However, employed amongst the guards and the SS overseers were a number of Kapos, prisoner functionaries, who were actually held as inmates, but they were given a small bit of power and responsibility. These Kapos worked for the Germans, and many were complicit in the executions and the crimes of the concentration camps. At the end of the war, a number of Kapos would be turned on, as the camps were liberated, and many were killed by the prisoners. But on the huge hill in front of thousands in Gdansk, a number of Kapos who worked at Stutthof were executed amongst the guard staff. Join us today as we look at the executions of the Kapos of Stutthof Concentration Camp, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Stutthof Concentration Camp opened following the invasion of Poland, and as soon as the war broke out in Europe, the Germans were rounding up people to be imprisoned there. The first prisoners had to make the camp, and over time it expanded to a huge scale, and dozens of barrack buildings were made to house huge numbers of prisoners. The camp staff was made up of German SS guards and later Ukrainian auxiliaries that were brought in, but also many women guards worked at Stutthof, as women were imprisoned at the camp. The SS would search for women in the local area to work there, but Stutthof's prisoner population came from a number of different countries. The conditions of the camp were very harsh, and tens of thousands of inmates would succumb to disease and starvation. Lots died from typhus, and the disease would spread around the camp a number of times, but many who were deemed too sick or weak to work were sent to the gas chambers. Executions at Stutthof were carried out by gunshot also, and gassing would take place later, with thousands killed inside of the site there. Also, execution using lethal injection occurred, and prisoners were clubbed and beaten to death, and some were even drowned in the mud. The prisoners were forced to work in many different industries, and lots of prisoners worked in the armaments factories located next to the prisoner barracks. Other prisoners worked in local businesses such as brickyards, but a huge network of forced labour camps emerged around the main site. But amongst many of the guard staff, as mentioned, were a number of Kapos or prisoners inside of the camp, who were assigned jobs and tasks by the SS to do. The Kapo system was designed to make victims turn against the other victims, and it was hoped they would instill the discipline and fear into the prisoners, which would limit the amount of work that the SS guards would have to do. Many Kapos were recruited from violent criminal gangs that existed before the war, and some were known for their brutality towards other prisoners. The SS would tolerate the brutality of the Kapos, and these men were spared the hard labour, and they were in charge of overseeing groups of inmates. The Kapos acted as a secondary hierarchy of power, and it made it easier for the Nazis to control the camps. It was usually between 5 to 10% of prisoners who were functionaries who were given these roles, and Kapos were often hated by the other prisoners. They were spat at by the other inmates, and were seen as henchmen for the Nazis. Some Kapos received extra food and easier roles, and others would take part for the fact they wanted an easier ride. But the system of using prisoner guards was a key part of the domination in keeping prisoners down. The rules of the concentration camps were horrific, and there was constant threats barked out by the Kapos, as well as humiliating punishment ordeals. They would be known for punishing entire blocks and barracks for slight infringements of the rules, and they became at times more hated than the SS guards. The Kapos had a terrible reputation, and many experienced guilt after, as they were ultimately prisoners too. Himmler would state on the role of the Kapo that, the moment he becomes a Kapo, he no longer sleeps with them. He is held accountable for the performance of the work, that they are clean, that the beds are well built, so he must drive his men. The moment we become dissatisfied with him, he is no longer a Kapo, he is back to sleeping with his men, and he knows that he will be beaten to death by them the first night. They did get better barracks and also better food, and they could prevent the gassings of some prisoners at times, and could protect some prisoners from persecution. They would also at times see the transport lists, but there were some Kapos who became Oberkapos and more senior, but if they did offend the SS, then they would be sentenced to death, and would be deemed as a prisoner, and would therefore be sent to the concentration camp's gas chambers. Kapos ran a fine line between life and death, but at the end of the war they were seen as a disgusting, power-hungry collaborator. Many former Kapos were brought to trial, and were later sentenced to death and time in prison, but they tried to defend themselves, saying they were just following orders. Of course, many Kapos went power-mad, and would beat and brutalise workers on a daily basis. There were many Kapos who worked inside of Stutthof, and these would be responsible for the oversight of prisoners, as much as the SS guards were at times. But Stutthof became known for its brutality, and the Kapos there would regularly go too far. In late January 1945, the evacuation of Stutthof began, and the Kapos helped the SS enforce this. Nearly 50,000 prisoners were evacuated and were marched towards the sea, and were then executed after being forced to walk into the sea when machine guns mowed them down in the water. But at the end of the Second World War, the Stutthof trials took place, and this was an attempt by the Polish authorities to bring some justice to those victims of the camp by trying a number of people who worked at the camp. There were some men and women guards who worked there, and they were accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes. But also there were other Kapos who were brought to trial. These were Tadeusz Koplinski, Kozlowski, Józef Reiter, Franciszek Sopocnicki, Kamiers Kolowski, Jan Brajst, Alexei Duzdal, Jan Price, and Marian Zielkowski. Of these people who were on trial, it's important to remember they were ultimately prisoners of the camp, who were given and accepted extra responsibility and roles by the SS. But it was known that many of these Kapos took their roles too far, and some were known for their extreme brutality. The courtroom heard each case, and because of this they would issue different sentences to the Kapos of Stutthof based on their actions inside of the camp. Kopczynski, Kozlowski, Reiter, Sopocnicki, and Brajst were all condemned to death for their crimes. These were considered Kapos who had taken the lives of other prisoners regularly, and who had exhibited extreme brutality, and for these 5 Kapos they were given death sentences. Another Kapo in the second Stutthof trial, Nicolaisen, would be executed. The other Kapos from the first trial were given time imprisonment, and 2 were found not guilty, but also 1 died in prison from a heart attack. Of those who were to be executed, the condemned were all held inside of a prison in Gdansk for a short while, until their execution date came. This was the 4th of July 1946, and there was a huge set of gallows which had been made on the Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdansk. All of the guards and Kapos were executed in the same way, in front of the 200,000 strong crowd, and they were one by one loaded onto the back of vehicles and trucks with an open back. These trucks were then backed up under the gallows, and on the vehicles were officials and executions would carry out the death sentences, and they also read the proclamation of death. The condemned would sit on a stool until they were told to stand, then a noose was thrown over the gallows. They then had the noose secured around their necks. Whilst they were then stood on a stool, the vehicles they were on would slowly drive away, and the noose would go tight, and the former guards and Kapos of Stutthof Concentration Camp were all left swinging on the huge gallows, and they were left for some time before they were cut down. Kapos were seen inside of the concentration camps as brutal people who were, despite being prisoners, often power-mad, and they would carry out beatings and executions themselves. Some Kapos would hang rule breakers, and they would perform the jobs that the SS guards became notorious for, taking the lives of inmates on a daily basis. But they were prisoners who had been given power, and they were the second hierarchy of power within the camp, and they were spared hard labour, and because of this many inmates turned against them. Kapos were beaten to death as camps were liberated, as they were seen as disgraces and collaborators with those SS members who inflicted such horror and torture. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.